I couldn't possibly be more excited to tell you about New York City's hottest museum right now. The Frick Collection in Manhattan has just reopened in its original Gilded Age mansion, and it's the art event of the year. Set inside a steel mogul's Manhattan palace, this place holds one of the most breathtaking collections of old master paintings in the entire world. I'm Toby Nomad, your favorite art, history, and museum expert, and I'm taking you inside to show you the top 10 most famous and most fascinating masterpieces inside the Frick. We're gonna jump into the top 10 really soon here. Mr. Frick had incredible taste in art. But before we do that, give me just a tiny piece of your attention to explain to you who Henry Clay Frick was and why this place is so important. Henry Clay Frick, born 1849, died 1919, was an industrialist who made his fortune in steel and was a key partner of Andrew Carnegie. Frick was also responsible for violently breaking the Homestead Strike in 1892, which cemented his reputation as one of the most hated robber barons of the Gilded Age. But Frick also loved European art, and he used his wealth to amass a legendary and blissful art collection. Thankfully for us, the world-class art that his wealth and power accrued is now available for all of us peasants to see. Many of us descendants of the working-class families across the nation who suffered and sacrificed so much to build the prosperity that allowed for such lavish wealth and exquisite collections to exist here in the first place. The Frick Mansion on Fifth Avenue overlooks Central Park and was completed in 1914 by the very same firm that did the beautiful New York Public Library. After Frick's death in 1919, the mansion was converted into a museum per his will. It opened to the public in 1935. After a 5-year closure in 2020 and a $220 million renovation, the Frick Collection officially reopened to the public on April 17th, 2025. And this video is the first top 10 list ever made of the Frick Collection. Let's get started with number 1. And these are not in any specific order because they are all wonderful. The first painting is an absolute showstopper, and it's one of my favorites in all of art history. This is Giovanni Bellini's Saint Francis in the Desert. This is early Venetian Renaissance. Let's take a look at this fantastic painting. Here we see Saint Francis stepping out from a cave into a radiant Italian landscape. He has his arms spread open. He's receiving the stigmata, which I'll explain in just a second. This painting is one of the greatest Renaissance paintings in all of America. It's celebrated for its detail and its spiritual depth. It was painted in 1480, and Bellini pioneered the use of atmospheric light. He was the founder of what's called the Venetian Renaissance, and he was the teacher of some of the other great Renaissance painters, Titian and Giorgione, to name just two. This painting is packed with symbolism. There's a skull, which represents mortality. A monk you'll always see in these older paintings will have a skull with him because it reminds us that one day we're all going to die, and we have to appreciate this fleeting moment that we have. There's a donkey, it represents humility. There's a laurel tree, which symbolizes victory, and a glowing walled city, which symbolizes divine inspiration. Saint Francis of Assisi was one of the most influential Christian figures of the 13th century. He founded the religious order, the Franciscans, that is still in existence today. In the year 1224, after withdrawing to La Verna, a hermitage in the Apennine Mountains in central Italy, it's alleged that St. Francis received that stigmata, the wounds inflicted on Christ at the time of the crucifixion. The composition is populated by animals of all types. I've already mentioned the donkey, but there's a heron, there's a kingfisher, there's a rabbit. Together with the shepherd and his flock, they appear oblivious to Francis's spiritual vision. Francis famously lived in communion with the natural world, which he celebrated in his poems and prayers, and most famously, there's a poem he wrote called Canticle of Creatures. It includes a compelling commentary on this painting, and I love it because it is so universal, and I feel like it steps so much outside of the bounds of restrictive medieval Christianity that it speaks to everyone. This is what he said. "Be praised, my Lord, through all your creatures, especially through my Lord brother sun, who brings the day, and you give light through him. Praised be you, my Lord, through brother wind and through air, cloudy and serene, and every kind of weather, through which you give sustenance to your creatures." All of us can find a bit of humanity right here in St. Francis's face, accepting the world as it is and letting everything happen all around him. With grace, with perspective, with the sincere desire to do good, and with the ability to experience the intimacy with beauty and the natural world around us and the fellowship with other human beings. Next, we have an absolutely mesmerizing and glorious painting by none other than Rembrandt. There are actually quite a few Rembrandts in the Frick collection. It's wonderful. But this painting, called The Polish Rider, is the best. It's from 1655. Of course, it's from Dutch Baroque, the Dutch Golden Age. It depicts a lone rider in Eastern European garb as he travels through a moody, unsettling landscape. He's possibly a nobleman, possibly a martyr, or a figure of moral allegory. It's still debated. We don't know Rembrandt's intention here. This painting is one of Rembrandt's very few full-length equestrian portraits, and he does an amazing job with the horse, if you ask me. It's also among Rembrandt's most mysterious works. He uses that signature subtle use of shadow and texture to give emotional weight to this unknown rider. This painting has actually been called, quote, one of the greatest poems of the world, end quote, by the celebrated art historian Kenneth Clark. We don't know who commissioned it even, and we don't know the reason. Past and modern viewers alike have probably seen existential fear and isolation in this painting. We have a man who is in his prime, he's beautifully dressed, he's on a wonderful horse, but the background is absolutely blurry and obscured. It's basically an isolated, small, unsure figure surrounded by vast, unknowable landscape. So imagine seeing this after going through one of the world wars, during the Cold War, in our modern time of digital alienation, in the coming of artificial intelligence juggernaut. It all makes sense. Everyone can identify with the painting of someone all dressed up, ready to go somewhere, but the place to go is amorphous and cloudy, and the future, and even the past, possibly unknown, confusing, and ununderstandable. This painting has been compared to Don Quixote, the novel. It's been compared to Hamlet in its beauty. It's basically saying, what am I riding into? We can all relate to that. Another interesting fact is that we don't even know if the rider is actually Polish. The association with Poland began because a Polish purchaser bought the painting and was kept in Poland for a very long time. But Poland had a very rough history. It was partitioned, it was part of many different empires. It did not have a very stable time throughout the last few hundred years. There was a Polish person named Tarnowski who sold this painting in 1910 to Henry Clay Frick in order to gain funds to buy back Polish land that had once belonged to the family. This was at a time when Poles were longing for the recreation of their homeland, so it added in that extra poignant value to this painting, even though we really don't know the actual subject. The last thing I want to say about this wonderful piece that you can see face to face at the Frick is that it has been commented on by a very famous American poet named Frank O'Hara. He's addressing his lover in a 1960 poem. The poem's called Having a Coke with You, and it talks about this painting. That's how big this painting is. Okay? He says in the poem, I look at you, and I would rather look at you than all the portraits in the world, except possibly for the Polish rider, occasionally. And anyway, it's in the Frick, which thank heavens you haven't gone to yet, so we can go together for the first time. That is how impactful The Polish Rider by Rembrandt has been throughout history. And if this is your first time experiencing the Frick, welcome to the beauty of it. All right, the next work of art is actually an entire room of painted panels. It's by Fragonard, and it's called The Progress of Love, and it has the most fascinating story of any room here in the Frick, in my opinion. What this is a cycle of romantic scenes. There's 4 of them, 4 large canvases: flirtation, pursuit, confession, and bittersweet reflection. These are beautiful paintings in the Rococo style in and of themselves, but the most fascinating part is who they belong to and her story. So while we look at these beautiful Rococo masterpieces, let's talk about Madame du Barry, or Madame du Barry. These paintings were originally commissioned by Madame du Barry for her pleasure pavilion, and then she ended up rejecting them. But let's talk a little bit about this Madame du Barry. Who was she? Well, she was Louis XV of France's last mistress. But don't take mistress lightly. She was very important. She was very powerful. She was given a lot of money and a lot of access, and she really lived it up. She had come from a very humble background. She'd been a housekeeper, she'd been a hairdresser, many other jobs, and she'd also been a sex worker. The king ended up bestowing a title upon her and elevated her to the position of official royal mistress. Remember, this is France. They do things a little bit differently. He spent the last 5 years of his life with her. She was very, very important. Madame du Barry was adored and sometimes despised by those around him, depending on who you asked. So these paintings show the 4 stages in an amorous relationship: the proposal, kind of the beginning, the secret meeting, the marriage, and then the peaceful enjoyment of the happy union. But she ended up not liking them. She rejected them, and she eventually replaced them, and we don't know why, but people speculate that maybe it hit a little bit too close to home. Her story ended up being even more interesting and tragic than I thought, and it's really quite an amazing experience standing there in the Fragonard room, surrounded by these paintings that she once was surrounded by, and thinking of her story. After Louis XV passed away, she was sent to a nunnery for a while. Eventually, she was arrested and then beheaded in the Place de la Concorde, a main square in Paris that you can still see today. It was said of her, she was the only woman among all those who perished in those dreadful days, unable to face the scaffold with firmness. She screamed, she sued for pardon, and she begged the crowds not to kill her. It caused quite the scene. This is how Madame du Barry faced her ending. And they did chop off her head. Fragonard, the artist, never had his reputation recovered after she rejected him. But what do you do when your art gets rejected? You can cry or you can throw shade. Fragonard, he threw shade in powdered wigs and pastel. He's quoted as saying, "I would paint with my ass if that's what they wanted." Iconic, bitter, legendary Fragonard. Some say that this Rococo movement, and particularly this artist, was a precursor to Impressionism, and you can see some of that in its softness. It captures the light and the elegance of this artistic period and the time before the French Revolution's upheaval. It's almost kind of a mockery of the frivolity of the upper class of that time. And now here it is in the Fragonard room at the Frick, creating a full art immersive experience for everyone to see. Do not skip this room at the Frick. A fantastic painting by John Constable called The White Horse is the next painting on our list. It's from 1819, and it is a wonderful example of the English Romanticism movement. Here we see a tow horse ferrying a barge across the River Stour under a vast English sky. This happened in Constable's native Suffolk. This is the first of the historical, monumental Stour paintings. So Constable had a father who owned a mill. This would have been a scene that he grew up with, or a romanticized version of a scene that he grew up with. This painting actually launched John Constable's rise to prominence, and it redefined landscape as high art. It's called a 6-footer because it is huge. It's so wonderful to be able to get to see something like this in real life. It's just like seeing a Turner, which we'll see shortly. So he called them 6-footers. It was his term for large-scale exhibition paintings, and they were meant to command attention. Here we see the merging of tender rural nostalgia with real meteorological observation. He's getting different elements of the weather right here. Now, what is going on here in art history and world history that is so significant? Well, what's happening is in the beginning of the 1800s, we are on the verge of one of the greatest revolutions in world history, and that's the Industrial Revolution. And England would be the leader of the Industrial Revolution. It was already beginning by the time Constable painted this painting in 1819. People were starting to move from the countryside where they had lived for hundreds of years into the cities. And with this came a nostalgia and a longing for the countryside, probably on behalf of the poor peasants who moved into the cities, and probably also on behalf of the people that owned the large estates or mills in the countryside, and that was once their quiet way of making a lot of money. I can't really take my eyes off this painting. There's so many elements that just let my eyes and my mind wander. I love the little boathouse. There's a struggle going on between some of the bargemen, but that is completely subsumed by the bucolic nature of the landscape. It's just a wonderful statement. I love how you could see the reflections in the water. This was actually one of John Constable's favorite paintings as well. He kept it to himself, actually, until his death. He actually sold it and then bought it back. It's absolutely one of his favorites. If you want to see another breathtaking John Constable, it's called The Haywain, and it's in the National Gallery in London. And I also did a top 10 video about that. If you like this kind of museum deep dive, do me a favor and hit the like button right now. Make sure to subscribe to this channel if you want to be one of the first people to know when these new videos are going to come out. I'm always going to do the same level of dedication to giving you the most accurate and interesting information. So if you hit the notification bell when you subscribe, you will be the first to know every time a new one comes out. You're probably already getting sick of me saying how much I love these paintings, but it's just one of my favorite museums in the world. So of course I love all of these top 10. This one is absolutely no exception. It just thrills me. It's called The Forge, and it's by Francisco Goya, one of the 3 classic old masters of Spanish painting, one of the absolute greats. It was painted between 1815 and 1820. It's actually called Romantic Realism. It's starting to get in that period where we're looking at realistic images of everyday life, not necessarily romanticized. It depicts 3 blacksmiths as they hammer heated metal in a space that is completely stripped of background or context. So you're only focusing on the 3 people that are working here in this forge. It evokes strength, it evokes survival, and kind of a timeless dignity of labor. It evokes different things depending on which character you're looking at. I mean, one looks very strong and one looks almost old and decrepit, so you're almost seeing kind of cycles of life. And the most emotional face is actually the man who is on the far left. He looks a little bit uncertain. Is this talking about the uncertainty and the freshness of the people that are thrown into this new industrial age? Did Frick buy this painting out of a sense of feeling like he's part of that industrial age, or out of a sense of guilt and a desire to have some sort of communion with the workers that that he exploited. Well, I'm sure he didn't probably think that he exploited them, but he perhaps wanted to feel a sense of giving back to them or showing them in a dignified way. We really don't know why he bought it. This painting was likely painted in the shadow of Spain's political chaos after the Napoleonic Wars. Everything's changing, and we're jumping into this new industrial era. Spain a little bit further behind, England, but nevertheless changing forever and changing the nature of what people do with their lives. Frick collected pictures that he found pleasant to live with, and that is a quote. So somehow he found this painting pleasurable to live with. I find it pleasurable to see. This was called Goya's introspective black period. And you can sit and have an introspective moment of it yourself at the Frick. The greatest thing about the Frick is that there are just so many greatest hits. The artists here that stand out are artists that are in pretty much everyone's vernacular. This one is a Vermeer. Now remember, there are only 33 Vermeers in the entire world. New York City really stands out. The Frick has 3 of them, and the Met has 5 of them. This painting is Johannes Vermeer's Officer and Laughing Girl, and it's arguably one of the most interesting and beautiful Vermeers in existence. Here we have a bright room, a soldier swashbuckling here, and he's kind of in shadow. You only see part of his face. And we have a woman kind of in the middle of a laugh or a giggle. So Vermeer is capturing a moment. Not only is that classic light coming through the window here in that studio that Vermeer probably had upstairs, painted so many of his paintings in, but we are just seeing a real life moment captured hundreds and hundreds of years ago, almost 400 years ago, in a really unique, beautiful way. You can also see a map of the Netherlands hanging behind the woman. This is really significant. This symbolizes nationhood. It symbolizes exploration. Remember that Vermeer and Rembrandt were painting during the Dutch Golden Age. Holland and the Netherlands were in some ways the center of the world. They were the center of exploration. They were the center of riches and wealth and this new burgeoning middle class. And they were also one of the centers of the slave trade. So this painting actually begs the question, what type of intimate moment are we actually looking at over the shoulder of this swashbuckling Dutch soldier? Are we looking at a beautiful courtship between peers and equals, people of similar status? Or are we looking at a transactional situation between someone with a bit of money and possibly a sex worker? According to art historians and historians, both would have been very common and very plausible in this time period where Holland was the center of the world, had a lot of money, was very urban, and had a lot going on. So the interpretation is really up to the viewer, but I think that really adds a layer of depth, as all great art really does. And it leads us into a greater discussion, which I love to do with art. You know, art is so wonderful to look at and stimulating to the eye, but it becomes even deeper when it becomes stimulating to the soul and to the intellect when it reflects upon the greater trends of what's going on with humanity and world history. So modern scholarship has increasingly emphasized the human toll, the hardships that the global trade of the 17th century had on so many different groups of people. Of course, we think about the slaves who were extracted from their homelands and forced to work on sugar plantations and making tobacco and things like that, which is the reason that countries like Holland had the money to look this swashbuckling. But I want to connect this one a little bit personally. It was really fascinating to me in researching this painting. My very first ancestor to come to Quebec in 1665, not long after this painting was painted, he was eventually killed by the Iroquois in what were called the Beaver Wars. This conflict devastated both the natives and the French-Canadian settler communities. There was a cost to both sides. What were they fighting over? They were fighting over the beaver trade. What is this soldier, this swashbuckling man wearing? He's wearing a beaver felt hat. They were all the rage in Europe You had to have one if you wanted to have any status, and beavers had basically become extinct in Europe because the trade was so voracious that they'd killed them all. So this globalization that brought this kind of wealth and this cute, intimate exchange had so many interesting side effects and so many interesting costs. Was Vermeer aware of this? Was he slyly commenting on it? Or was he blissfully lost in the exchange between this swashbuckler and his young catch? We will never know, but you can sit and ponder it at the Frick, and I hope you do. I can't wait to go back here. This next painting is Sir Thomas More, and it's painted by Hans Holbein the Younger. I have probably annoyed everyone in my friends and family circle because I haven't been able to stop talking about this painting from 1527, the Northern Renaissance. 1527, so we're talking about almost 500 years ago, and it looks better, more expressive, and more clear than any photograph I have ever seen. So that in and of itself should give you enough reason to want to see this painting. Everything about it is wonderful from an artistic standpoint, but it's also interesting if you think about the person that was painted. So let me tell you a little bit about him and what's going on in this absolute masterpiece. Probably second to the Bellini, the most famous painting in the Frick. It's actually on the signs that you see outside. So here, Sir Thomas More wears fur-trimmed robes and a golden chain of office. He's got that sharp stare, and he appears reserved and conscientious, which we will see in just a second is very significant. This is one of Holbein's most psychologically intense portraits, and it's executed with that absolute pinpoint realism. It was painted at the height of More's political influence and shortly before his execution in 1535. This is a portrait of principle under pressure. I'm not even sure how much of that exists in today's political climate. This is a moral statement in oil on canvas. Sir Thomas More eventually was executed because he refused to accept the king as head of the Church of England. For that, he was convicted of treason, locked in the Tower, just like Henry VIII's wife, Anne Boleyn. And he was finally beheaded on July 6th, 1535, 8 years after this stunning portrait of him was painted. The Catholic Church calls him a saint. He was definitely, though, a humanist. He was not a Protestant, but he was in that gray area where he supported many of the values that the Protestants were pushing towards. So he really is a creature of conscience, and you can see that in this painting. Holbein would become Henry's court painter the year after Sir Thomas More was executed. Let me tell you a little bit about Hans Holbein the Younger. He was not from England. He traveled from Basel, Switzerland to London in 1526, a year before painting this one. He had worked with Erasmus. He had done illustrations for him, and he entered the intellectual circle of Thomas More. There's another painting very close to this one, also in the Frick, of Cromwell, who was different than More, but part of that same Henry VIII intrigue. Thomas More was a scholar, and he was the author of the famous book Utopia. He served King Henry VIII as the Privy Councillor for more than a decade, and he later became the Lord Chancellor in 1529. He's got that gold chain around him, and that's an emblem of service to the king, who would eventually have him beheaded. How interesting is the circle of one's career and the ups and downs that can be faced when you are working with a tyrant. Come and take a look at this painting and look at the eyes of Sir Thomas More and try to see something of ourselves in it here at the Frick. This next painting was basically the painting that you would see on the cover of a book if you bought a book about the Frick collection. It is the classic Frick masterpiece. It is just simply austere, beautiful, well executed, and elite. It is called The Portrait of the Comtesse d'Aussonville, and it's by Jean-Auguste Dominique Ingres. That's Ingres. Of course, Ingres. It's painted in 1845. It is French neoclassicism. Neoclassicism should remind us of the great French painters like Jacques-Louis David, who has The Death of Socrates just down the street at the Met. But let's look at this painting. The Comtesse lounges here in blue satin, twisted in an elegant, oddly tense pose. Ingres was the leader of the neoclassical school, and he was elderly when he painted this painting. Here he blends classical grace with kind of an uncanny stillness. Every hair and the silk fold, every little fold here is perfect. This was painted when he was at the height of his fame as a portraitist of the elite. Her mirror reflection is also so interesting. It adds subtle commentary on vanity, identity, and perception. Her opera glasses are placed there on the mantel. This shows her class and her status and her ability to comprehend things of an intellectual nature. The Comtesse was an accomplished writer in her own right, but that's not emphasized in this painting, which makes it even more interesting. She actually wrote a biography of the poet Lord Byron, but she had to publish it anonymously as requested by her husband. You'd never know any of that from this portrait, but still, she treasured this portrait. They actually speculated that Ingres must have been in love with her the way that he painted her here. So here, he does give her grace, but it's possible that he is also subtly critiquing the limitations of her gilded cage. She's both an icon and a prisoner of her class. And if you've ever seen the movie or the musical Les Miserables, those times are coming. More revolution is on the way in France and all around the world. What's going to happen to this upper class who have lives of luxury and frivolity? And is this a precursor? Are her eyes giving us a warning? Or are they merely just here for our enjoyment the way she enjoyed the opera? Number 9 on today's list is a stunner that I am sure you have never seen and never talked about. I'm going to tell you why you should. This is called Portrait of Philip IV in Fraga by Diego Velázquez. Now, you may have heard of Velázquez. He's one of the 3 most famous Old Master Spanish painters, Goya, Velázquez, and El Greco. Velázquez was absolutely the king of painting kings, royals, dwarves, young children that were part of the court in ways that were incredibly accurate and incredibly intimate. And he was a wonderful painter of men. One of his most famous paintings is actually in the Met, just down the street, of a young man that he kept as a slave that helped him in his studio. It may have actually helped him with this painting. But let's talk about this one because it captures a king of Spain in such a realistic, emotional, and raw way that, in my opinion, it is unmatched, especially when you combine it with the way that he painted those sleeves. That is just sick. So, this is Spanish Baroque, painted in 1644. Of course, it's oil on canvas, like almost everything on this list. King Philip IV stands here in military red with sword and a baton, and it's during the Catalan Revolt. That means Catalonia. That means Barcelona. Even today, those echoes reverberate. There is a Catalonian independence movement still going on. So we've been talking about this, painting about this, thinking about this for 400 years. This is a wartime portrait that projects royal stability with subtle psychological depth. I mean, look at the eyelid. Look at the eye. Look at every little curve of the haircut. Velázquez strips away idealism completely, and he gives you a ruler who looks weary but composed. This is a propaganda piece, right? So he is saying here that this king is so great that even though he is carrying the weight of the empire, the Spanish Empire in 1644, the greatest in the world has ever seen, he's carrying it on his shoulders, and he's able to do so and still stand up tall and still be the king that he needs to be, even though he's weary and forlorn. He is still there for you, his royal subjects. This was painted when he was on campaign in Fraga, so he was not at the court center. He was out doing his rounds, making its realism even more impressive that he sat for this on one of his tours. This painting is thought to have been Henry Clay Frick's favorite painting in his entire collection. It was sent to Madrid ahead of the king. The portrait was shown in the Church of San Martin for a mass celebrating victory. It was placed where Philip would sit. His painting effigy effectively stood in for him as a proxy for the king. That's how important this painting was. What was going on here historically that makes this so interesting, besides the Catalonian Revolt, which is interesting in and of itself? What is going on here? And you can see it in the face. The Spanish Empire is in decline. Its dominance in Europe is decelerating. Think about that as you look at his face, as you look at his frilly collar, as you look at the red and yellow, which are the heraldic colors of Aragon that had become so prominent, but maybe aren't anymore. Looks like he also has one of those beaver felt hats, part of those beaver wars where my ancestor died in. This affected everybody and everything, what's going on, even if it happened in Spain. So globally, Spain's empire at this time still spanned from the Americas all the way to the Philippines, but its hegemony was eroding. Rivals like France, England, and the Dutch Republic, which we saw in Vermeer and Rembrandt, are on the rise. There's a long-term trend going on here, one of military and financial overextension. And you see that when you look deeply at this propaganda piece here at the Frick, which in and of itself is a propaganda piece. Go to the Frick for this multi-layered experience. I hope I'm helping you to do that. We only have one more in this list. Let's get to it. This is probably the first video that I've done for this channel where every piece in the top 10 was something that I wouldn't call anything less than fantastic. I'm gonna end on this beautiful J.M.W. Turner. That's the British Romanticist, and this is called The Harbor of Dieppe. This has personal resonance for me, and it has a beauty and a luminescence that anybody can relate to. And I'm gonna help you do that by explaining it right now. Just first keep in mind the size of this painting. This is a huge Turner, and it feels like you are actually standing. Look at this point of view here. It's so big, and because of the point of view, it makes you feel like you're standing there in the harbor of Dieppe as the world changes, going into industrialization, which seems to have been the theme of so many paintings here in the Frick, I think not by coincidence. So this was painted in 1826. Some people call it Proto-Impressionism, a precursor to Impressionism, and you can see why. Look at the water, look at the sky, look at the softness, look at the blending of the lights there. So this is a luminous French port filled with ships, sunlight, swirling color. It really exemplifies Turner's obsession with light and atmosphere and motion. And this also talks about what's going on. We had just come out of the Enlightenment. Science was very prominent and would become even more prominent. This is almost around the time of Darwin. So we're learning about the atmosphere. We're learning about the hydrologic cycle. We're learning about how humans interact with the elements. So much of a Constable or a Turner is the sky, that environment in which we all live. So just like the Renaissance, where we started to look at the natural world more deeply, I think we're taking another step here in looking at the sky and the weather more deeply with Romanticism. It's wonderful to do, it's wonderful to think about, and it's wonderful just to experience, even if you don't think about that. So Dieppe was a real place, and Turner, the artist, visited repeatedly, even though he was British. Dieppe was actually in France. But here it looks almost mythic, and that is what's going on in a lot of Turner's paintings, because just like Constable, which we saw earlier, this is happening at the time where peasants who had lived on the land and worked in an agrarian economy for centuries were moving into cities. One of the nicknames for this painting is actually changement de domicile, change of home address. And you can actually see in this painting that there is a bit of a focus on someone who is it was probably moving in to Dieppe. A lot of people were moving in from the countryside to the cities. Part of this was called enclosures in Great Britain and in France as well, because they were taking away what had been common land that people had grazed on and farmed for centuries, and they were basically turning it into private for capital areas. And the peasants and the workers, like my ancestors in France and England and many of yours watching this, had nowhere to go. They were forced to go into these cities. What Turner's doing here is he's romanticizing that experience, and he's actually doing so a little bit deceptively. He's leaving out some elements that would be here that would show modernization. You don't see any steamboats, and there would have been steamboats, right? You don't see smokestacks, and you don't see things like that, because this is a romanticized version of the city. And there's a reason for that. First of all, it's popular. Why is it popular to show a romantic view in this time period? Why is it popular to show that in 1826? Again, because just like Constable, people were longing for the days of yore. They had remembered growing up in that beautiful countryside, even though their lives for most of the peasants was probably bleak. Maybe buying this painting is a way for a rich person to not only feel better about the life that once was, but to feel better about urbanization, right? Let's imagine you're a rich, wealthy person who would buy a Turner, and you own a factory, and it's brutal. And the people who, like my ancestors, are coming off of their ancestral land, and now they're working in cities as spindle turners, and the conditions are so bad that they end up moving to the Americas in the land of nowhere, where they have to fight with natives or fight in the Civil War in order to survive and cut down, hundreds of trees and build land in the middle of nowhere. That was how bad the industrial conditions probably really were. Turner is romanticizing it. We don't know if he's doing it because he finds it therapeutic, or because he thinks it's therapeutic for the people seeing, or is he doing it as a way of whitewashing history so that these bourgeois factory owners don't feel guilty about bringing these people off of the land to work in these even worse conditions in the middle of cities? We have no idea, but Turner's paintings are some of my favorite paintings in the world. I like to believe that he saw a transition happening and he wanted to comment on it emotionally, and that he was aware that we were losing something and gaining something in this transition. Ultimately, Turner is proud to be British. Britain is becoming the world's first industrial superpower. And even this seemingly tranquil scene, like the harbor here in Dieppe, reflects the broader currents of dominance and global change. Oh, wow. It was really incredible going to the Frick. It was incredible being able to share my passion for it with you. I hope you come with me to do this with other museums in the future. I've already done the Met, which is just down the street, MoMA, the Museum of Modern Art, which is just down the street here in Manhattan, and you can check out those videos as well. I have videos coming up of the Morgan Library and Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, and international museums like the Louvre. And you can already see two wonderful international museums that I've done. The National Gallery in London, which is probably the greatest painting museum in the entire world. You're also going to be able to see probably the best Constable and the best Turner over there in that video, and I explain it just as well. You also get to see another Holbein. There's actually a lot of parallels between this museum, the Frick, and the National Gallery in London. I really hope you check out that video as well, because there is such a strong connection between the great museums of New York City, MoMA, the Met, the Frick, and the great museums of London and even of Paris. The great museums of London being the National Gallery, the British Museum, and the Courtauld. So come along with me on this adventure. Click subscribe if you like this. Click the notification bell so you always know when videos are coming out. And please, in the comment section, feel free to criticize. That is what makes us better. I don't want to be someone who is just blowing fluff out into the universe. I really want us to enjoy art, to appreciate art. I want it to be relatable to people that are intellectually curious, but really also to anybody who just wants to enjoy bathing in color and beauty. But I want to make sure that my videos are accurate and interesting. So if you find something that's incorrect, or even you think is an opinion that you have a strong opinion the other way, feel free to leave that in the comment section. That's one of the beautiful things about YouTube. I love talking to all of you. My channel is still small enough that I'm responding to most of my comments personally, and I love to do it. And most importantly, let me know which painting was your favorite, and let me know which museum, whether one of the great museums of America or one of the museums of Europe, that you're dying for me to do next. I love doing top 10s because they're extremely controversial. There's no way to please everybody, and it gets everybody talking about art. So see you in the next one.